Hello everyone. Welcome. I am Julie Zuckerman, author of the Book of Jeremiah, and welcome to the March Literary Modiin author event. For those of you who are new here, this is a monthly author series featuring books with Jewish content, mostly fiction, but occasionally narrative nonfiction, memoir, and poetry. Actually, tonight we're going to have three fiction books. Um, we have a very large English-speaking population here in Modiin. So back in June 2019, I started Literary Modiin as a way to bring local Israel-based authors to the large community of English readers. And we held several in-person events until the pandemic hit, and then we switched to virtual format. And that allows us to hear from authors and welcome attendees from all over the world. So we've been going on for almost 7 years, and this is our 70th event. Um, so the format of today's event is that each author will speak for about 15 minutes and then we open it up to questions. And everybody in attendance is on mute, but you can put any technical difficulties in the chat box, and put all your questions for the authors in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. And just a special note, I hope that those of us in Israel won't be interrupted by any sirens, not me and not Rachel, who's going to be speaking first. If we are, then I have Wi-Fi in my safe room, so I'm just gonna carry my computer down and you'll meet my whole family. Um, but hopefully that won't happen. Okay, I'm gonna introduce our first author. Rachel Caplin is the author of The Spoon in the Sea, a best-selling historical fiction novel. Born and raised in Australia, she moved to Israel in 2015. She works as the director of brand and communications for an Israeli tech giant AI, and she lives in Renana with her husband and their young daughters. So, Rachel, I'm gonna spotlight you,
Great.
and
Thank
then
you.
you can take it away.
Hi, everyone. Um, we were saying before all of you joined that this is a most welcome distraction from a very exhausting, very, very difficult, very challenging time here. So thank you all. Truly thank you all. It's been a lovely thing to look forward to today coming and get to talk about books. So thank you for having me. My name is Rachel Kaplan. I am the author of The Spoon in the Sea, which, as mentioned, is a historical fiction novel. I'm going to share my screen just because I have found through the numerous book club talks that I've given that typically this helps to answer a lot of questions for those who have or haven't read the book. So if you bear with me for just a moment, I will share my screen. You can all see my screen, I hope. Yes, great. So, in order to really give some context of the book, a little bit of context about me, to explain my accent, I'm from Perth in Western Australia, which is about as far from the rest of the world as you can possibly get. I've been living in Israel now for 10 years. As mentioned, I'm a marketing executive here in the very vibrant tech industry in Israel, married to Eitan, who is currently serving at the Schneider Children's Hospital as part of his Army Reserve duty. I'm a mum of three young girls, aged 6, 3.5, and 1. I'm actually 31 weeks pregnant now, with our fourth girl on the way. Please God, due in May. Please God, this war will be over by then. And on top of all that, I'm an accidental author, and the accidental part of that is as important as the author part. So to explain how this happened and where this book came from, um, I found it's helpful to begin with a family tree. There's me at the bottom, as you can see. Um, and there are four characters in my family tree. All of their names have been changed. And basically, this is a book that was born out of a story. I'm sure all of you have a crazy family story that people would always talk about at the Shabbat table. And someone said, someone needs to turn this into a book one day. Someone needs to turn this into something. So this is the story that my family would always tell, which was basically my great grandfather. This is a true photo of him speaking on behalf of Israel at Hyde Park. He was a very active member of the Zionist movement in England. A very traditional Ashkenazi Jewish family from Golders Green. Pretty run of the mill in many ways. But one thing I will add, Dafka tonight, is that one thing that he did was that during all of the air raids in London, he volunteered as an ambulance driver. And I remember always hearing that And now, what we're living through now, when I think about how brave that must have been and how remarkable that must have been, I think it tells you a lot about him as a person. I didn't get the chance to meet him, unfortunately. So, my great grandfather, we'll call him Abraham, had three daughters. One of his daughters was my grandma, and he had another daughter, and we'll call her, for the sake of this book, Rose. The story that I grew up hearing was that Rose, again, a good Jewish girl from Golders Green, went to university very soon after the war ended. And there she met and fell in love with a man called Faisal, who you can imagine my great grandfather Abraham at the time was not thrilled about. And basically, the story goes that he tried to send Rose away to then British Mandate Palestine. It was pre-1948 Israel to try and get him and her separated, essentially. One thing led to another, and I won't go into too much detail because it reveals a lot about the book, but it turns out she joined him in Zanzibar, where it turns out he was the chief justice of the country, basically second only to the Sultan. They had a child. In real life, his name was Salahuddin. So this is my great aunt from Golders Green who had a child called Salahuddin. Um, and again, without going into too much detail of what happened, at some point she left him behind and she went back to England, and he was very young. And I was always troubled by this decision. I couldn't understand it. They reunited at some point, and they had a relationship that, by all intents and purposes, was quite close. But I was always very, very curious as to how you could leave your child, what that means, how he felt about it. But the good news is I didn't really have to guess because he and I are very close. He is my mum's first cousin. And over the years, I would always, prod and ask questions about him growing up as the child of the number two in this island country off the coast of Africa that people sort of haven't really heard about. Such a fascinating character. So he and I are very close, and over the years, we had many, many, many conversations. And I used to say to him that my dream was to one day bring his story to life because I think it's a story that the world should hear. Like there are so many of these sort of hidden gems around the table that every family talks about. In 2018, my grandma, who was one of the great loves of my life, she passed away after a long battle with dementia. And for anyone who has had an experience with someone who they love dearly, who they have watched pass away, anyone who has had someone close to them who's passed away from dementia, knows what an emotional experience that is. And for me, it was certainly that. It was before I had kids. And I basically managed to get to Australia to be with her around the clock for her last 10 days. And a few things really struck me. One was that I found that the experience of dementia in that final phase was nothing like I'd read about or seen in movies. It wasn't this linear progression that just gets worse and worse and worse until the end. There were moments that she came in and out. Some of our most profound conversations would come moments after she could barely speak. And I found it to be very different from what I expected. I found it to be a very beautiful experience as much as it was obviously painful to lose her. At the same time, I then came back to Israel and I was overcome by this feeling that nobody here knew her. Nobody knew that I was so heartbroken that I missed her. And I was essentially driving my husband mad. I wouldn't stop talking about her. I had all these memories, I had all these feelings. And he said, "Why don't you write?" Now, this is where the accidental part comes in because I don't have any writing training. But he said, "Why don't you take all of this and then turn it into something?" He knew in general I liked to write, but I'd never written anything for anyone else. No one had ever seen anything. And I thought, well, what if I took my grandma and what if I sort of merged this experience of losing someone in real time, and at the time it was 2018, with this story of Rose and Faisal and Abraham and my cousin? What if I sort of blended these two together and I had this dual timeline story come to life in my head? That for the first time I could see how to tell the story that my family had been telling around the table for years, and at the same time could help me to process in great detail what it was for me to lose someone who had lived a full life and was succumbing to dementia in those really last two to 3 days. And that's where The Spirit in the Sea came to life. It wasn't called that originally. I went through, it was just called Untitled as a Google Doc on my computer for a while. Um, and I finished writing it after about a year and a half. And I remember I went to my husband, I said, okay, I finished writing. And he said, are you going to show it to anyone? I said, no, it's not a real book. It's just me writing on a Google Doc. And he said, oh, you should show it to a few friends. I thought, okay. So that was the scariest part, by the way, was to show it to three friends who I share books with. And all of them said, give us 2 or 3 weeks to get it back to you. And all of them gave it back to me after 2 or 3 days and said, we couldn't put it down. You have to do something with this. And I had no idea what to do. And one of them said, why don't you apply for an award? So I said, okay. So the Israeli market is fairly small. And all of the American awards that was somewhat familiar with, I wasn't eligible for, not being American. So I Googled Australian Book Awards, and the Vogel Award came up as the top. I didn't know it was the most prestigious award in the country, but I basically submitted the manuscript, and I honestly forgot about it. Months later, I'm then pregnant with my second child. I'm about to give birth. I'm about 6 weeks out, and I get a call from the Australian, which is the major newspaper. They're saying, congratulations, you're in the top three for the Vogel, and you're going to be in the newspaper. And we need you to sign this confidentiality award. This confidentiality agreement. This is how my family found out that I'd written this book. I have pictures from my cousins there with their coffee spilt all over the newspaper saying we just opened the newspaper. We're like, what the hell are you doing here, basically? Um, from there, I was approached by a number of different agencies. Again, in Australia and abroad, this is quite a recognized award. Um, I signed with one that had offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, which I figured would help sort of, broaden the coverage that I would get. And we spent quite a few months going through the developmental edits that it takes to sort of get from this phase up until it's ready to be shopped around to publishers. What happened next was that the plan was to begin shopping it around to publishers at the Frankfurt Book Fair. And the Frankfurt Book Fair that year was October 17th, 2023. So to be an Israeli author with a very Jewish name and a very Jewish book living in Israel in October 2023 was not in my favor at all. Um, and all of these publishers who had been waiting for it to be ready and we got it to them all of a sudden came back all saying the same thing, that it isn't the right time. And within a few months, I began to understand what that means. Um, I also began to understand it because my agent was encouraging me to change certain elements of the book, to change certain characters, change certain words, all of which were intended to dilute and to whitewash the Jewish nature of the book, the Zionist framing of certain things. The straw that broke the camel's back, there were two. One was that I found that they were telling people I was an Australian author, trying to basically bury the fact that I live here. Um, and the other one was it was in June last year when, ironically, we were in a 12-day war with the Iranian regime as we are now. And it was during that time I was already toying with the idea of should I just go out on my own at this point? Um, and the agency itself began to post vehemently anti-Israel content from their page, support very violently anti-Israel authors who were not even their clients. And it was at that point that I said, I think we need to go in different directions. And that was when I said, I'm going to use everything that I know from marketing products in the tech world, and I'm going to take this and apply everything that I know to this book. Um, and basically from there, this is where we are at now. The book only released about 7 months ago. It hit #1 on Amazon. It was a top new release in 3 categories as well. One of the most exciting moments for me was actually being featured on the Totally Booked podcast. Anyone who is a Zibby Owens fan, as I am, it was a conversation that she'd had with someone that really, for the first time, made me realize what was happening to me and the sentiment that I was experiencing with the publishing industry. And from there, there's been a number of different opportunities that I've had to have some exposure and coverage, telling the story of the book itself and also the story of getting the book out there into the world. Um, and if there's one thing to know, it's that my decision in going independently from the agency and, veering away from that traditional path was that if I'm going to be too Jewish and too Israeli, and this book is going to be too Jewish, then I'm going to be as Jewish as I possibly can. And I'm really, really unapologetic in terms of how much I lean into that. Um, One thing that I will say about the book is if it could be interesting to you or to someone that you know, these are a few things to know. The first thing is that it truly is based on these real people, these real events. Everyone who reads it, who I know personally, then reaches out and is dying to know how much of it is true. And there are parts of it that they say can't possibly be true. Trust me, it's true. And that's honestly what gave me the courage to write this book because I'm like, I have heard it from the people themselves, from the person who lived through this remarkable life that went from London to Zanzibar, British Mandate Palestine, and then, Israel today, through the Gulf, Bahrain, all different places you wouldn't even believe. Again, from a Jewish run-of-the-mill family in Golders Green. That's the first thing to know. The second thing to know is that I wrote what I love to read. So if you like historical fiction or someone you know does, the type of authors that I like, I mention here. So if you loved reading, The Beekeeper of Aleppo, The Nightingale, The Kite Runner, that's the style that I love to read, and that's what I tried to write. I don't dare to say that I achieved it, but I think that's really sort of where the inspiration comes from. The third thing to know is that I truly wrote it thinking nobody would ever see it. And I think there's a level of raw emotion that comes through with that because it was in no way filtered for the industry. It was in no way filtered for, is it too much? And the most emotional chapters, again, I mentioned I wrote this with the inspiration of my grandmother who passed away, are probably the most unchanged out of all of the chapters there. It is truly my heart on a page. So if you enjoy reading emotional things, or if you've had that similar experience, and this could be in any way cathartic or for someone that you know, keep that in mind. Next thing is, again, I think everyone has some experience with dementia or Alzheimer's in some way. It's the kind of illness that, is so pervasive in so many different places, and every family or friendship circle will experience it in some way. I really wanted to write something different. I found after the experience of seeing my grandma that everything else I'd read and seen was quite one-dimensional, and I wanted to write something a little bit different. So again, if that appeals to you or to anyone else. And the last thing, as I mentioned, this isn't for someone who doesn't want to read a book that has Jewish themes or the perspective of someone who lives in and believes in the state of Israel. This isn't the book for those people. I don't think that's the audience here today. But I think that if there is anyone, if it's you, if it's someone that you know, that all of these things could be interesting. Um, I always am happy to hear from people. There are a few faces and names that I recognize here in the audience who I know have read the book before. I love to hear from people. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I think I did pretty well for time if I look at the time now, right? There you go.
Perfect. Um, Great. That's great. Yeah, this audience, I think you'll find a very welcoming audience for books with Jewish and Zionist content. And it's so funny that I actually just started listening to a Kristen Hanna book last night, The Women's.
Ah,
Yeah.
wonderful.
Um, okay, so let me introduce we made it through without a siren. Yay.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay. Let me introduce our next author. Maya Arad is the author of 12 books of Hebrew fiction, as well as works of literary criticism and linguistics. Born and raised in Israel, she has lived in California for the past 23 years, where she serves as writer in residence at the Taub Center for Jewish Studies at Stanford University. The Hebrew Teacher, her first book to appear in English, uh, but through New Vessel Press 2024, and translated by Jessica Cohn, won the National Jewish Book Award And her novel Happy New Year's was published in English last year, also by New Vessel Press and translated by Jessica Cohen. So, and now she's actually, I think, in New York this year or this semester, but I will let her tell you about that. Um, Take it away, Maya.
Thank you so much, Julie, for doing this. And thank you all for being here at those very challenging times. So, I'm here to introduce my book, Happy New Year's. Here it is. You can see it. It came out in Hebrew in Israel in 2023, early in the year, under the title Shanim Tovot. And the English title is Happy New Year's. And it keeps the um, funny feeling that you have because Shanim Tovot were used to Shanot Tovot, the Happy New Year's cards. And I think Happy New Year's keeps the same sense, right? Because we wish each other Happy New Year. So Happy New Year's sounds a little bit like Shanim Tovot. So I said it was published in 2023, but in fact, the idea for the book came much, much earlier in 2009. I remember, driving the Highway 17 from Stanford to Santa Cruz on a very rainy day in February, and all of a sudden I had an idea. How about to write a novel comprised entirely of Rosh Hashanah letters, sent year after year during over 50 years? And it will be the story of one woman going to America and what happens every year. And I really liked this idea and I wanted to write that book, but somehow I kept putting it off. It took me 14 years to realize this project. Now, it doesn't mean that I worked on it for 14 years. It's just that I always had other ideas for books that were easier to realize, those lower hanging fruits. So I wrote this book and that book until I think in 2021, I decided, okay, either I'm going to write this book now or I'm not going to ever write it. So I decided to jump right in. So as I said, Happy New Year's is an epistolary novel with a twist. It's not just any letters, but it's 50 years of letters written by one woman every year on Rosh Hashanah. And the premise is quite simple. Leah Moscovich, a young Israeli woman, comes to America in the mid-1960s to teach Hebrew at a Jewish day school. And every year, just before Rosh Hashanah, Leah writes a letter to her old friends from the teachers' college, telling them about her news for the past year. Now, the 50 letters in the book give us a complete picture of one woman's life from youth to old age. And over the years, we follow Leah's ups and downs as she navigates relationships, marriage, divorce, single motherhood, financial struggles, and also professional ups and downs. We also follow world events in America and in Israel, like the Yom Kippur War, 9/11, the Rabin assassination, and the 2008 financial crash. I can add, while I'm speaking about this, that those 50 years that are in the book, actually it's from 1966 to 2016, those are years where there are huge changes in the world in the status of women, the status of LGBT people, and also the stigma attached to Israelis who left Israel, those who are called in Hebrew Yordim. So those changes are also reflected in the book. Just to give you one example, in 1970, Leah justifies herself for not coming back to Israel. She says, look, I'm not a Yoredet. On the contrary, I'm on a Zionist mission. I came to America to teach Hebrew to Jewish children who might one day make Aliyah. In the late 1980s, when her friends are asking her, okay, now you're divorced, you can take the children and go back to Israel, she says, I built a life in America. I don't want to give up this life, and my children are American. In the 1990s, the question doesn't even come up. Okay, so this is as far as the content of the book goes. But this is just a part of the story. I should add that Leah is a very unreliable narrator. Decades before social media, her letters present a very rosy facade of life in America. She pretends to be living the American dream and is trying very hard to mask the difficulties that she faces. For example, Leah never admits in her letters that she has financial difficulties. Instead, she says, oh, we managed just great with one car, or, I enjoy shopping at yard sales, or I love cleaning my home by myself. I don't need a cleaner. She also doesn't write that her husband can't keep a job, but rather, every year or two in her letters, she announces great news. Jeff has a new job. The reader has to figure out why Jeff changes jobs so frequently. So I think in this kind of novel, an epistolary novel, um, the work that the reader has to do is harder. You really have to read between the lines and also figure out what is not being said, not just what Leah writes. But I think the reward is also bigger because, it's like every letter is like a piece of a detective story. So to understand Leah's true circumstances, the reader really has to play detective and probe between the lines beyond Leah's relentless cheerfulness. And as we do so, we often see Leah's personal disasters well before she does. This is also part of the reward. We can tell that the marriage is in trouble, or we can see, well, this is part of our historical perspective, right? We can see the 2008 financial crash coming. Or in the case of the Yom Kippur War, right? In Rosh Hashanah, when Leah writes a letter just before Rosh Hashanah of 1973, and she writes to her friends, I can tell we're all going to have a wonderful year. We have the historical perspective. We know what comes 10 days after Rosh Hashanah, what a terrible war that will have a significant effect on Leah's own life. And while, Leah may seem naive and it's tempting to poke fun at her positive thinking, we gradually learn to admire the resilience. I'm sorry, I wrote this word before, we talked before about, resilience being talked now and, we all had enough of this word, but Leah really is resilient. And also her relentless optimism that keep her going despite all the bumps along the road. I should mention that the book ends in 2016, and after I published it, people told me, why did you stop so early? I really wanted to know what Leah would say about the COVID pandemic. And later on, they said, and what she would say about, October 7th, and so on. And, that's right, but I really had to stop somewhere, and I think 50 years is quite enough. Now, as Julie mentioned, the translation is made by Jessica Cohen, and it's a wonderful translation. Jessica is a wonderful translator. I really think of her as my co-author of the English version of the book. And this particular book had a special challenge because I tried to keep Leah's language as authentic as possible. And therefore, her letters in Hebrew are full of 1960s and 1970s slang that went out of style already when I was growing up. And Jessica somehow found a way, I think, to keep it in English, to keep Leah's style and Leah's optimism and bubbliness. I will give just one example. Leah has a favorite expression in Hebrew. Whenever she says she wants to say that she doesn't care what people talk about her behind her back, she says, I don't give a hoot. In Hebrew, ani metzeftzefet. So this is just an example of how Jessica could capture Leah's style. And since I mentioned Leah's optimism, I want to read from her 1979 letter, in which she finally comes clean to her friends about her divorce. And I hope this gives you some idea about her bubbliness and her optimism and some idea of the book. So I will read now from the book. It's page 90. 20th of Elul, 5739, September 12, 1979. Dear Mira, Pnina, Devora, Rivkale, Zehava, Tzipi, Rina, Shoshi, Aliza, Yochi, Nechama, and Dina. Shalom. Another year has come and gone, and soon we will enter not only a new year, but a new decade. A wonderful opportunity to renew old ties and hear what's new. The last year has brought about a significant change in all our lives. I know you've already heard about it, but unfortunately, what you heard is half-truth at best and utter lies at worst. As a wise man named Mark Twain once said, a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. That is why it's important for me to write to you personally and explain exactly what happened, even if a little belatedly. Please feel free to pass this information on, especially if you encounter any rumors that certain migratory birds might have brought to Israel on their summer vacation. So here it is without any sugarcoating. I got divorced. I have nothing to hide and nothing to be embarrassed about. Here in America, divorce is no shame. Quite the opposite. First of all, it happens to everyone, or almost everyone. Did you know that 50% of marriages end in divorce? Second, getting divorced means responsibility for your life, giving yourself and your children a better future. After all, that's a fundamental right in America. It's actually written in the Declaration of Independence, the right for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Pursuing happiness is every person's right. If you're not content, you get up and leave. You don't stay together for 40 years out of fear and inertia, like some people who shall remain nameless. And speaking of people who shall remain nameless, I don't know what rumors have reached you, but they're all false. Jeff and I separated amicably, respectably, and without any scandals. We realized that we weren't a good enough fit, that our love had faded away over the years, and that it would be best for us to stop being a couple and each pursue our own happiness. Jeff didn't run away, he just moved to New Mexico, hoping the change of scenery would do him good. Naturally, he doesn't see the kids every week, but that does not diminish his responsibility and love for them in any way. Any talk of him as having abandoned them is sheer malice. And as for the rumor that Jeff isn't paying child support, unfortunately, he's dealing with some debt at the moment. But I'm confident that as soon as he gets on his feet financially, that will get sorted out. That's it, the whole story. It's that simple. I imagine you have many questions because I ask myself a lot of questions too. And trust me when I say that I gave it a lot of thought before taking this step. For example, isn't divorce selfish? Won't it hurt the kids? Well, that's the thing, no. There are lots of studies showing that children of divorced parents are more successful in life than children who grow up in a home with two parents who have a bad relationship. But won't the children feel different? Of course not. As I mentioned, 50% of marriages end in divorce, which means there are plenty of children around them in the same boat. But what about your own future? Thank you for your concern. Everything's fine. I have a vocation and a job, and I'm getting along very well. But aren't you afraid of being alone? I'm not alone. I have two wonderful kids, and I have friends, and I'm positive that in due course I will find new love. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you. Thank you, Maya. She's like a wonderfully unreliable narrator. Maya. Um, okay, let me introduce our third author. Howard Langer was born in Manhattan in 1950. He attended the City College of New York, as well as the Greenberg Institute in Jerusalem and the University of Toronto, and law school at the University of Pennsylvania, where he has taught for the last 20 years. His law practice has specialized in protecting the vulnerable. He began writing The Last Decrepitzer, his first novel, in 2021 after attending a Zoom workshop by George Saunders, sponsored by the Free Library of Philadelphia. Inspired by Saunders' presentation, he began writing the next morning and what morphed into the novel. The novel has won a National Jewish Book Award and was a finalist for the Athenaeum Award. Howard and his wife live in Westmount Airy in Philadelphia, and he has two adult sons. So let me spotlight you, Howard, and unmute you or ask you to unmute. And you can take it away. You're still muted.
Yep.
Okay, there you go.
Well, as you can see, seeing me, I'm quite different from the two people who came before me. And I always wanted to be a novelist. And I saw this presentation during COVID by George Saunders. And in the presentation, he gave three pieces of advice. The first one being, if you want to write, you've got to stop thinking about it. You've got to stop talking about it. You've got to do it. He had two other pieces of advice that'll come up perhaps later. One was that when you're writing, you always have to remember that the goal is to get the reader to turn the page. And finally, that there's no end to revision. Still tempted to revise the book. Well, anyway, I said to myself, I'm 70 years old. If I don't start writing the book now, I'm never going to write it. And I had no idea of what the book I was going to write was going to be about. But I knew that I wanted to write something that would in some way ameliorate the condition or the relationship between blacks and Jews in America, which I thought were very, very poor. So the next morning, I sat down and started writing, and with great facility wrote about 60 pages longhand in what I thought was Black English of some Black soldiers liberating a concentration camp. Then my mother-in-law took ill. I put it aside. I looked at it again a few months later and said, "This is junk." I threw it out and began a short story about a man who's discovered fiddling in a New York City subway station in the 1960s. And the man speaks Black English. He's a white man with a big beard. And a gentleman starts talking to him. And it emerges that this man is the decrepit Rebbe, the only survivor of his sect. And the story told something about the sect. And it got published in Tablet magazine at some point. But my therapist saw the story and said to me, "Howie, that's not a short story, that's a novel." And I said, "Oh, come on, don't be ridiculous. It's 8 pages." And she said, "No, it's a novel, and you probably won't have to see me for a year or two." And I went home and I said to myself, that woman knows you 10 times better than you know yourself. If she says it's a novel, you've got to give some credence to that. So the obvious question was, how did the Rebbe end up in the subway station? And I had no idea at the time. In fact, I had several false starts about how the Rebbe ended up in the subway station. Well, he ended up in the subway station because he'd been brought up to be a Rebbe. And the war came. He'd fortunately been shipped off to Moscow because the Rebbe's in his sect always fiddled. And a certain Russian soldier, when Decrepitz was in the Russian sector in World War II, shipped him off to Moscow to improve his fiddling. And he ended up spending the war in the Russian army. He found himself at the end of the war on wharves in Naples, saw some Black American soldiers jamming with their music. And he took out his fiddle and started playing with them. And they kind of adopted him and eventually smuggled him back to Mississippi. Well, as a result of all the different talks over the last year, I come to realize that the book really involved an experiment. And it was, first, you have a Rebbe with no Hasidim, a man who's lost his whole purpose in life. And instead of arriving in the Northeast, where all, well, I wouldn't say all, but where many survivors ended up, he ends up in rural Mississippi among the Blacks and begins adopting their culture. And the third thing about him was when he was in the Russian army, he had traveled back west with the Russian army and gone through the Ukraine, and there were no Jews there. I had read about this myself in Vasily Grossman, who was a great Russian writer who was in the Russian army during that time, and he had this astonishing experience of arriving in the Ukraine. He himself had been from Berdichev and finding no Jews. So the Rebbe, he thinks that there are no Jews left in Europe. He knows a little bit about the Jews in America, but they seem to be very foreign from everything he's heard about them. And he knows that there are some Jews in Palestine. So he adopts life in Mississippi, where he is considered the rabbi. He's not fully adopted by the people there, but they treat him very kindly, and it gives an opportunity for me to show how common life in rural Mississippi was with life in a shtetl before then, because the Rebbe's basically able to do the same things he did before the war, but this time among the Black people there. And it gave me an opportunity to blend the two cultures. So instead of writing a book about Black soldiers freeing Jewish people, I ended up writing a book in which a Jewish man kind of becomes Black. And then he marries a Black woman who he converts in Mississippi, and eventually they flee north to New York, where they both are the subject of a certain form of discrimination. the wife, a black woman in New York in the 1950s, is going to find no place in the Jewish world. And he, with his black English and his his black English with a Polish accent, no less, is completely alone in the world. And it's about living and putting life together in the shadow of the Holocaust, because the Rebbe, he fiddles in defiance of God. Words have left him. He just fiddles as he tells his son to remind God what he did to his people. And he's contrasted with his wife, who kind of brought this great Christian love to her Judaism and relates to God out of love. And the book is about how music, the music of his fiddle, and the many different musicians he meets over the course of the book, and his love with his wife allow him to function in the world after the Holocaust. It wasn't my intention to read much of my book to you, but if I have a few minutes, I'll read one scene in which, I'm sorry, you're giving me a signal there, Julie? I have time to read it, you're
Thumbs
telling me?
up. Yes, you have time.
Okay, so this scene is in Mississippi, and it's at the deathbed of the father of the soldier who saved him, who he's become quite close with over the years. The father's name is Harold Carr. Harold sent Willie to fetch Shmuel Meyer. Shmuel Meyer is the Rebbe. Harold looked small, buried in the sheets. Shmuel Meyer sat down by his bedside and took his hand. Harold stared at him and moved his lips before the words came. Young man, I asked you when you first came here if you were a rabbi. You remember that? I remember. You ain't answered me straight. No, I didn't. You a rabbi, ain't you? Yes, I'm a rabbi. You pray for me, Rabbi. I've been praying for you, Mr. Carr. I pray for you all the time. What's your prayer? I pray for the healing of your body. My body's finished, Rabbi. Best pray for my soul. Mr. Carr, your soul's pure. You raised your boy and he volunteered and went and fought the great evil overseas. Taught him goodness so that in the end he saved me. You took me in when I ain't had nothing and treated me like your own. Your soul pure. Your life been good and filled with kindness. No, Rabbi, my soul's all soiled with sin. I need your prayers. Reverend Birch would say he pray for me, but you, Rabbi, I need your prayer. You dead wrong, Mr. Carr. Your soul pure, if any soul pure, but you can have any prayer from me you ask. But why my prayer so important? Because you seen him like nobody else here seen him. The Bible don't got nothing that match what you done seen. Your prayer will be a special prayer. When the time come, I'll pray for your soul. I brought my fiddle to bring you some music, my music of prayer too. No, prayer need to be words. That's how we learned. I'll pray for you. I'll pray for your body so long as you have a breath of life, and I'll pray for your soul. And when your soul is released, it ain't the custom for my people to pray for the soul when it's still in the body. With words and with music. In the Hebrew language that Birch would say is his language. In the Hebrew language, it's the only language I can pray in. But here, I'll play you a nigun like I played back when we first met. He started a nigun that was part of his grandfather's morning prayers, but then stopped. Harold turned his head and said, "Fix me, Jesus." Shmuel Meyer played and the sick man rasped, "Fix me, Jesus, fix me. Oh, fix me, oh, fix me, oh, fix me, Jesus, fix me. Fix me for my long white robe. Fix me, fix me. Fix me for my starry crown. Fix me, Jesus, fix me." Days later, when Harold died, Shmuel Meyer stood outside his shack looking at the coops they'd built together and recited the traditional prayer for his soul, El Mole Rachamim, in the language that was his language. The opening words, God filled with mercy, stuck in his throat, and he forced his way through to the words praying that Harold's soul would rest eternally in Eden among the holy ones. Then he took up his fiddle and prayed until his bow arm gave out. Anyway, so I hope that little section kind of combined the two aspects of my book, the Black and the Jewish. And I won't take your time. Well, here you can see it with its backwards cover.
No, we see it fine. We see it fine.
Oh, it comes out
Yeah.
right. Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
on mine, it comes out with a
Right.
mirror image.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Howard. I'm gonna add all of our authors back to the spotlight and ask them to unmute. Add to the spotlight. Add myself here while you guys are thinking of your questions and putting them in the chat. Mostly in the chat, there's a lot of praise for all of your books from people who have read them. Um, and a comment from Erica that who knows what did you what a great origin story. Who knows what gems may come from this Zoom. So I look forward to hearing about people who've written books after attending this literary Modiin or any literary Modiin. Okay, here is a first question, also from Erica for Howard. Was there any pushback to creating a fictional Hasidic dynasty? Although I can imagine that there might have been pushback to using a real one too.
Um, the truth is that there was no pushback. I was afraid the Boviver Rebbe is a key character in my book, and he's a hero in the book, frankly. But I was afraid that I'd get some pushback from Boviver Hasidim in some way, but I've never heard anything about it that way. The only pushback that ever came was when I first started writing the book, you could tell a decrepitzer because he had one straight payas and one curly payas. And my wife pushed back against that and said, no, that can't be.
Mhm.
So when everybody asks me why the decrepitzer plays his fiddle holding it in the opposite hand that people do, I tell him that it's a replacement for his bizarre payas, which is really what it is.
I want to ask actually that a similar question to all of you, which is Rachel, did you get pushback or what was the reaction from your family? Um, Maya, did you get any pushback from Israelis who were yeah had moved to America or vice versa in any level? And Howard, any other pushback about from the Black community? Um, have you had audiences in the Black community who've read the book? Curious to hear. But let's start with Rachel.
Um, for the most part, my family has been incredibly supportive, especially because they know that the main character, the protagonist, the narrative voice, was a part of the research and the writing of the book. So they know that everything that came from him came with love and generosity of his honest perspective on things. There are a few members of my extended family that um, I, I, I wouldn't be sure how they feel about it.
Okay.
So, what I missed when I told you about my idea about writing this book is that I do have a relative in my very extended family that followed pretty much the path of Leah, meaning that she actually I have two of them,
Mhm.
both on my side and on my husband's side. Someone who went to teach Hebrew in America. One person stayed for a couple of years, found a nice Israeli guy, got married, and got back to Israel. The other person pretty much followed Leah's path. She got married, she got divorced, she moved to real estate. So it was at the back of my mind, but it's someone from the very extended family. So I just, I think it's within my rights. And, I didn't write about anyone in particular. It's just followed a certain path. So.
Great.
Um, I certainly didn't get any pushback from anybody. In fact, most people who read it in manuscript told me I didn't have to worry about telling people what I was writing about because nobody else in the world would write a story like the one I was writing. So, but I did find exactly the same, well, not exactly the same, but the same problem that Rachel did. First, I couldn't even get an agent at first. And a couple of agents were honest enough to tell me that a book like mine by a white Jewish author with so much Black English in it, and I didn't write the Black English in my book. I had a consultant who translated what I had written into Black English. And we were very careful about the particular Black English, but they said it didn't matter, that the publishing industry was just the worst that way. And I eventually published it myself. And you said that it was a runner-up for the Athenaeum Award. It actually won the Athenaeum Award, but then when they realized Gresham Press was kind of a front for myself, they took the award away. So they left me as a finalist. Um, I did face that kind of pushback, but other than that, it's been the opposite. I've just been blown away. The one large black group that I spoke to was a seniors group, which meant that they would have been of the age of the Black Panthers of that very anti-Semitic period in the Black movement. But they were the most embracing group I had. I went in there with 20 copies of my book, and I left with none. And they all came afterwards to discuss the book with me. I'm going to be on Black radio in Chicago next month, and that'll be much more interesting, I think, because I've had a lot of trouble. I really wrote the book hoping to explain Jews to Blacks and Blacks to Jews, but I've not been able to get a lot of traction in the Black community. I've had a few Black people who Jewish groups had as the interviewer for me, and frankly, they were almost indistinguishable from the white interviewers, except I have to say this, there was this very lovely Black pastor from Philadelphia, and he thought that the Rebbe fiddled joyously. And anyone who read my book who thinks that the Rebbe fiddles joyously, it's just just shows you that it's
He's
in the
quite
reader.
clear about that. He's not doing it joyously. He's
Right.
had, interesting. Interesting. Okay. Okay, we have two questions from Maya. Are you considering another epistolary novel with responses to the letters in your first one? Or I'll add to that, or like a sequel. Like I would like to know what Leia thinks of like 2016, Trump America or through the present. And having moved to the US a generation after your protagonist, how is your experience as an Israeli immigrant to the US similar and different from hers?
All right. So for the first question, I did consider at the beginning, I thought, okay, I'll have Leah's letters, and then, maybe as an appendix or an afterword, some of the responses, not all of them, but at least some. But pretty soon I realized that it's going to be packed as it is. So it's just too much to process. So I decided to leave it, a one-sided 50 letters with a forward and afterward, and that's it. It was with a heavy heart, but it had to be done. Sometimes, writing is about, knowing what to write and what to leave out. And yes, so I moved to the US. I first came to as an exchange student to Cambridge, Massachusetts in the mid 90s. And I moved to California in the early 2000s. So it's about a generation after Leah. So I did a lot of research to try to, I talked to Israelis who lived in the US for 45, 50 years, asked them questions. Very often they didn't remember, if I asked, did you need a special visa or how much money were you paid as a Hebrew teacher? They did not remember. But soon I found out that when I stuck to material things, like if I asked, what was the first car that you bought in America? Or what was the first computer? Then, they would remember and the memories would come out more easily. So I talked to people about that, about, people who came shortly after the Six-Day War and feeling, the feeling of admiration towards Israelis that, we can only imagine today. And then, as in the 90s, I spent time in California since the late 1990s. So a lot of what's in the book I witnessed myself, the first high-tech boom in the early 2000s, and then, the crash, the California housing crisis in the first decade of this millennium and all those things. Even, minor things like Google moving into Mountain View and Mountain View becoming, from a place that's, almost like a slum to a place where you can't afford to buy a house. So later in the book, I was there. Now, of course, my experience was different because I did not have to deal with the stigma that Leah had to deal with. And also, I guess because, Silicon Valley is a community, has a huge Israeli community, and you can live within an Israeli community, which Leah does too. But early in the book in Massachusetts, like many Jews at the time, she becomes part of the Jewish local community. And she writes with wonder about, they have this synagogue where they sit together, men and women, and they drive on the Shabbat to synagogues because she doesn't know anything but Orthodox Judaism, which you had in Israel at the time.
Great. Okay, let me see. Wait, more. Here we go. A question for Rachel from Susan. Is there a significant body of Australian Jewish literature as there is American Jewish? And do you think you will ever write about Australia Jews?
Is there a body of literature? Yes. Is it significant? Not enough. There's a fascinating story of how the Jews got to Australia and how it's changed over time. So there are a few books, but I would say it's definitely something that's untapped. Would I ever write about Australian Jews? Um, it's not. I'm close to finishing the draft of my second book, which again doesn't tap into the Australian Jewish story, but I do think at some point that will be something that I dig into. And again, I think it's a really fascinating story of how the Jews got there. And here in Israel, anyone who speaks English, you're tagged as being American. That's the assumption. Uh, so I think at some point I'm going to want to sort of peel back the layers of that a bit and sort of show the difference of what it means to be a Jew in Australia compared to other places, which is obviously very, very, very different.
I want to ask all three of you. I mean, you touched a little bit about your publishing experiences, Rachel and Howard, but on this call we also have a lot of writers and everybody's a reader on this call, but also a lot of writers. So, what advice would you give for all of us on this call who are writers, possibly writing about Jewish themes or living in Israel? And Maya, you as well, of course. So what advice do you have for all of us?
I'm happy to share my advice.
Go for it.
I would say that for any debut authors who haven't been published yet, you're facing an uphill battle. It's not easy. That being said, I think there are some very supportive and strong Jewish and pro-Israel agencies and individual agents out there. If you're able to connect with them, never say never. But I think it also depends on why you're writing. What are you writing for? I can say for myself personally, I'm so happy to be doing this independently. I feel like I have complete ownership over the process in the way that I wanted. Maybe I feel that way because of the experience that I went through, that I felt the wrestling with that and not wanting to bend and to whitewash the best parts of who I am. So I would say it's an uphill battle. It's not impossible, but at all times to question and ask yourself, what are you writing for? And I think there are ways now more than ever to get your work out there that do veer from the traditional route that used to be the only way out there. And I think that technology and in general, the know-how of how to do that is far more available. And if there is anyone that, again, I really just tapped into what I do in tech and tried to apply it here. And I'm very, very happy to share that with anyone that is thinking of doing the same thing. I'm very happy to brainstorm and share what has worked and what hasn't worked as well.
I would say the same thing as Rachel. I described why and how I wrote the book, and I was fortunate that I was a quite successful lawyer. So when I wanted to publish it myself in the end, cost and so on was, no object. But unlike Rachel, I hadn't the slightest experience in marketing. And if the book hadn't won the National Jewish Book Award, it would have languished. And however good a book it was, no one would have read it. It sold just a few hundred copies until it won the award. And even since the award, we're talking, in the low thousands of copies that have sold, which is not a huge bestseller. Although I will tell you the one category in Amazon that it's been number one has been in blues music, which is not as comical as could be, but
That's
it every
cool.
so often comes up as #1 in the Kindle
Mhm.
blues music category, which is pretty funny when you think about it. But I did, when I was at a late stage, retain an editor, and she helped me dramatically. I mean, it stayed my book. It didn't change my book, but she told me to add certain chapters, and her line edits and so on were truly wonderful. And I really think a professional eye on the book is very important because people thought the book was fine before I gave it to her, and she made it wonderful.
Mhm.
So I write in Hebrew and I publish in Israel, but I agree with what both of you just said. So, namely, that it's in Israel too, it's an uphill battle, but there are so many ways of doing it yourself that, not sticking to the old method. You can, if you're good at it, you can publish it yourself and market it yourself. If not, there are wonderful professionals who can help you do that. And there's more and more recognition to books that were published independently in Israel, and I know in the US too. So, and also what Rachel said about, online communities of writers, it's a great resource. It's really great using it. And having said all that, some things are not within our control. So just, keep writing and
Mhm.
hope for the best.
Yep. Okay, there's a few more questions that just came in on the chat. First, Howard, do you play the violin? That's an easy one.
No, I play the banjo.
The banjo. Okay.
Um, uh, and I don't play it very well.
Okay. And Brienne is asking, Rachel, if you can give us a hint about the book you were working on. Your accidental authorship was a good thing. And she had a question. Oh, we'll get to Rachel and then we'll ask her question for her.
Sure. When I finished the Spoon in the Sea, people asked me if I would write a second book, and I said, "Well, I only wrote The Spoon in the Sea because I was so sad, so I hope to never write another book again in my life." And then
Ah.
October 7 happened, and I felt that same pain, and I felt that same need to write. But particularly, I was struck by people who were referring to October 7 as unprecedented, and I thought this is the most precedented thing in the world. And then I was watching the news a few weeks afterwards, and there was a particular hostage story that echoed eerily of a story I knew from my friend's grandmother in World War II, to the point that I said, I have to write something that shows this repetition throughout our history. The fact that October 7 is the most precedented event in the world. It is not unprecedented in any way. And how do we learn from that, and what do we learn from that? So that's the story that I'm writing now, and sort of pairing these different timelines together and these characters together, hopefully in some unexpected ways. Um, that generations to come who do not remember October 7, that's who I write this for. We all remember where we were on October 7, whether that was in Israel or anywhere else. I think about the generations to come that won't remember the day. And why did it shake us all so much? Why did it change people in such a profound way? And I think that to do that without taking a bit of a higher altitude, um, is not doing it justice. So that's what the second book's about.
Wow. Batzlacha. What can I say? Oh my
A
goodness.
beach read, basically.
Okay, I think this is our last question, then we'll wrap it up. And it's a question for Howard as to whether you've spoken to Black Jewish groups. We've done some such multicultural groups in New Orleans, and she's going to recommend that they speak with you about doing an event. But have you done any other Black Jewish
Well,
groups?
first, let me just thank you, Brianne, because you've written such wonderful things about my book here and elsewhere. I really appreciate them. I hope we'll meet someday. But no, I haven't spoken to any Black Jewish groups. Um, uh, that's the answer. I haven't. I'm happy to speak to almost anybody. In fact, it's the last couple of weeks, it's gotten almost ridiculous. I've actually had a couple of double feature days that I've never had before. But it would be interesting, I guess.
Very nice.
I should say I recently had, I don't know if you've watched on PBS here in the United States, they had a series of Blacks and Jews in America. And there was some article in the forward about that it didn't say anything about Black Jewish groups. And I got into an intense discussion where I actually raised my voice with somebody, which I almost never do, saying that's not what the show was about. It was about Blacks and Jews, but not Black Jews. But I think you mean something different there. I think you mean groups of Jews and Blacks, not Jewish Blacks, if I understand you correctly. But I haven't. I've only had that one occasion, actually, at the center that I swim at, which is in a Black neighborhood. So their senior group was the Black group I spoke to. I might just tell you, it's kind of interesting. The character that they liked, if for those of you who read the book, was the wife. And they liked the fact that she had as much agency as she had. And they also told me that her, she gets interested in Judaism and explains that part of it was that she couldn't bear the thought of Christ on the cross and so on. It just didn't seem like the father would do that to the son. But the same person who told me how much they liked her agency told me that a Black woman from the South in her era would never have had those doubts. And that was the only thing that didn't ring true in the book. So it's interesting.
Right. Okay, I want to say, I want to wrap up, but first of all, I want to apologize to anyone who came on just now, um, and was messed up because of the time difference. Usually we do it here in Israel at 8 o'clock in the evening, and 1 p.m. in the US. And because the US changed their clocks and we haven't changed it, we decided we would do it at 7 p.m. for us, but still at 1 p.m. Eastern. So anyone who missed the first hour of this, I'm sorry, and there will be I'll send out the full recording tomorrow. I also want to just highlight that we have a bunch of other events coming up. I think you can see my screen. So we happen to have two literary Modiin events this month, which we've never, or only once other time before. This is like a makeup event for Ziva Bukai, who was really sick and couldn't appear in February. And so we have Ziva speaking about her new book, The World Between, Sarah Ansbacher with her book, Another Shore, and Maxim D. Schreier with his book, Parallel Letters. And then in April, same week as Yom HaShoah, we have three Holocaust-related books: Elizabeth Rosner's Gravity, Martin Hershovitz's Son of the Shoah, and Doron Karen is going to speak about his grandfather's book, which just came out in English, and it's called what is it called? Beneath the Lightless Sky, about his experience surviving in the sewer. Um, and then in May, we have James Invern, who's, I think, on this call right now, speaking about his novel, The Inspired. Yardena Schwartz speaking about Ghosts of the Holy War, that's narrative nonfiction. And Elizabeth Polliner, who's also on this call now, I think, speaking about the name of your book. I can't see it from here. Spinning at the Edges. And then in June, we're going to have our in-person and on Zoom event. And Susan is here with us on the call all afternoon. And Nora, I think, just joined the call with her new book, Doubles. And Rachel Tzvia Bach, her book is The Dark Robed Mother. So I will send out links so you can already register and save the dates for all of those events. And I want to thank you very much, Rachel, Howard, and Maya, and thank you to everybody in our audience today and for the great comments and the supportive comments for everyone who's read your books. And you should all go out and buy their books and help support these authors. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
We have a good and a quiet week wherever you are, especially us here. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye bye.
Bye.